Hey, class. It's the first time I recorded at this location, so there's a little bit of background noise in this apartment. Hopefully, it won't pick it up, but there's actually a soccer field right outside the apartment. Um, maybe that just will create some little ambiance, but yeah, I doubt you can hear it. But anyway, hadn't made one of these in a little while, so nice to be back, I guess. And this is going to come from chapter 18, section 1. Uh, going to be kind of just briefly going through this, not a comprehensive look at everything in the chapter. But if you'd like to follow along or just get a deeper look at some of this, you can read that section. Not required. I'm not expecting full knowledge of everything in there. Just wanted to kind of pull out some high points and get an understanding of what was going on a little to the east of Europe in this time, which, as you can see, overlaps with the time period we've been looking at regarding the Renaissance and Reformation. And so this is titled "The Muslim World Expands 1300 to 1700," and notice subtitled "The Ottoman Empire." And what you'll notice here, kind of interestingly about the Ottoman Empire, this is, you could probably argue that the most substantial, most powerful Muslim empire that has arisen, and yet it wasn't Arab. We associate Islam with Arab countries and the Arabic language for good reason. The Quran is written in Arabic, and Muhammad is from the Arabian Peninsula. But the Ottoman Empire is rooted north of there, well, encompassing a bigger area, but to the north of Arabia. And today, the remnants of it are kind of in modern day Turkey. But in any case, we'll get into it and look at some key figures here in the Ottoman Empire and some of their things that they did. Okay, so picking up, like we said, around the year 1300, the Byzantine Empire had gone into decline. This is also known as the Eastern Roman Empire. And meanwhile, the Anatolian Turks, so Turks being the group of people from Anatolia, which is where modern day Turkey is, peninsula jutting out kind of into the Black Sea. So they're led by a guy named Osman. And as they emerge, grow in power, Westerners take notice and they name the entire group Ottomans after Osman. So this is kind of the nickname that is applied to them. The Ottomans saw themselves as Ghazis, which is a term meaning warriors for Islam. So obviously they're very militant, if that's a descriptor that they give for themselves. They conquered through the use of musket carrying foot soldiers. A musket is like a rifle, kind of a primitive rifle, and cannons. So, using this heavy firepower, even heavily walled cities fall before them. As you can think about, not long before this, a lot of fighting was primarily done with swords and that sort of thing. But now you have heavy firepower, and they used it effectively. So, okay, there I put his name as Othman. You do see different spellings in different times, but same guy, Othman or Osman, and his son Orkhan the First proclaimed himself Sultan. Sultan was a term meaning overlord, so obviously he has a pretty high opinion of himself. And then in 1361, the Ottomans conquered Adrianople, the second most important city in the Byzantine Empire. Okay, I'll come back here for a second because this got cut off. Most Muslims had to serve in Turkish armies, and non-Muslims instead paid a tax. So this actually derives directly from the Quran that if that Muslims are expected to serve in the effort of jihad. If a non-Muslim, well, at least a monotheistic non-Muslim is conquered, they're not expected to serve as fighters, but instead pay a tax. And so the Ottomans observed this. And there we go. Okay, so sometime later on in 1451, so quite a bit later than Osman, but you see the trend continuing, right? This Islamic power is kind of hammering Europe, and they're pushing and pushing. They've been fighting against the Byzantine Empire, pushing it back. And in 1451, Mehmed the Conqueror, also known as Mehmed II, he takes power and just forcefully declares, "Give me Constantinople." So Constantinople had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a one-time really important city for this Eastern Roman Empire. Where you find Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And so by now, Constantinople's size had actually shrunk from 1 million to only 50,000. Uh, Not sure all the reasons that led to this major decline, but in any case, it was still really significant because it controlled the Bosporus Strait. So maybe not as impressive of a city and not as many people there and everything, but in terms of strategy for trade and control of this area, it was still important. So Mehmed attacks. And the city did have this pretty interesting device, which was that they stretched a chain across the Golden Horn. So it's actually stretched across a strait, Strait. A strait is a really narrow body of water uh, that is naturally occurring. And so they stretched this between the Bosporus Strait and the Sea of Marmara. So, and what that does is it blocks ships from being able to come into this sea. But what does he do? Well, he actually drags 70 ships on greased runners. So up on land, runners are just they're like planks essentially, and drags them across into the Bosporus harbor. So he goes around dragging these huge ships, and then they're able to batter the harbor and attack Constantinople from two sides. And so ultimately, he did take the city, he conquered Constantinople. Kind of a tragic thing for the Byzantine Empire, and I would say for Christendom or Christianity broadly. But in any case, um, that said, when he conquered, did open Constantinople up to people of many religious backgrounds. Wasn't completely like just convert or die to everyone, but that said, it was clear who was in charge, meaning the Ottomans who were Muslim. Okay, and so then something to think about here is just what was Mehmed's primary target for conquest and why? Why did he want to achieve that? But I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so going to kind of skip over this one leader, Salim. He is significant because he conquered Islam's holiest cities, so worth knowing about for that. But the guy who really put the Ottoman Empire on the map is Suleiman, or Suleiman the Lawgiver, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. Sorry, Suleiman the Magnificent, and he took the Ottoman Empire to its peak size. So, like it says there, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and his armies advanced into Hungary and the outskirts of Vienna, Austria. That might be kind of surprising, right? We just can kind of segment in our minds where different peoples kind of belong, and we think, well, Europe, that's kind of where Christianity is, and then the Middle East, that's maybe where Islam is, and then the Far East, you find China, Asians, like Buddhism, that sort of thing. But Suleiman really pushed this force forward up into Western Europe. And so it took a lot for them to turn him away. He actually became the most powerful monarch on earth, only having one close rival, which is Charles V, who was head of an empire called the Habsburg Empire. Okay, now throughout this course, we've looked at different types of conquerors, some of whom have just sort of purely been conquerors, maybe like Alexander the Great, but then others have had more of a sense of actually running an empire and organizing it. So Suleiman does fall more into the latter category. He did want to actually have an organization for his empire. So here's some of the major things that he did. Created a law code for criminal and civil matters, organize and reduce government bureaucracy. He did own 20,000 personal slaves, which he acquired as part of a policy called the Devshirme policy. This policy drafted boys from the peoples of conquered Christian territories. So, and a draft means that you are conscripted, you are forced into service, right? So this isn't something that, theoretically was supposed to happen by a sort of strict observance of the Quran, but in any case, this is something that Suleiman did. There were actually some families, Christian families, who bribed officials to take their children into the Sultan's service, which might seem like an odd thing, right? Why would you want to give your child over to the control of this Muslim Sultan? But it kind of gave them more status, probably gave their families greater protection as they achieved position in his empire. But that said, while some families did that, others were certainly forcibly taken from their families and forced to convert to Islam. 30,000 of those taken by the Sultan were specifically trained to be this elite fighting force known as the Janissaries. So that's bolded, it's a term you ought to remember. The Janissaries were loyal only to the Sultan, and they would actually fight against Christian forces. So it's kind of this, double whammy that they're not only defeated and forced into service, now they have to go and fight against Christian forces. And actually, they pretty well remained loyal to him. So I don't know if they were brainwashed or whatever you want to say, but they definitely uh, they did conquer it for the Sultan. You'll hear a little bit about this in a video you're going to see in terms of how the Janissaries were used. But in any case, officially, Christian and Jewish communities were treated as a term called millets, and that's another word for essentially like a nation or a people, and allowed to follow their own religious laws and practices. Uh, I'm skeptical, and I'm not an expert, admittedly, in this area, but I'm skeptical that they were truly given extensive freedom. But this is something that was like supposedly what they were meant to be able to have, to be treated as a people with some degree of rights and as religious communities. Okay, so this is just kind of a funny little meme that I found of this. And it says, Ottomans, when they see a Christian boy from parents that couldn't pay the jizya is the Islamic tax, you'll be a soldier. In other words, oh, well, if you're not going to pay, then guess what? Your boy is going to be taken from you and conscripted into service. Again, there were some who would have volunteered their children for this kind of service, but I'm sure many, I have to imagine more that were forced into this kind of service. Okay, and last thing about Suleiman, there was some cultural flowering under him. As we looked at in the West, you had the artistic renaissance in the West. Suleiman gave us the Sinan Mosque, which is today often just called the Suleiman Mosque. And so I think there is a degree of an aesthetic to this kind of mosque. They can be appreciated. What I do find interesting is if you see this mosque and then you look at other mosques around the world, you may notice that there's really a lot of similarity as you find these different mosques in different places because Islam is a religion that very much encourages conformity and sticking to a certain way of doing things. And there are also sort of specific religious reasons for doing things in one way versus another at times, regarding that Islamic art is not supposed to uh, portray things from the real world. So, like, you wouldn't have paintings of people, for example, but these geometric shapes are okay. So, all right, that's all I'm going to say about this chapter. I hope it gave at least a little window into the Ottoman Empire. We'll talk a little bit more about it in class, but I'll let it go for now at that, and I will see you all soon. Actually, just one quick note, sources for images are listed there.